Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. In today's world, especially here in America, we seem to get a lot of news about countries around the world that give us the feeling that they're causing us trouble. But it's also good to look at the other side of the mirror to figure out, well, what is it that we do here in the United States that causes these countries to feel such animosity toward us? Maybe it's time to get away from the biased journalism and dig a little bit deeper to find out what perpetuates some of the particular things that go on here around the world. One specific country we'll be talking about today is Iran. That seems to be a hotbed subject for a lot of people as they listen to the 6 o'clock news here in America. Let's find out what's really going on over there from the perspective of someone who actually grew up there that can share with us the rich history of that particular country and how it's become what it is today. On the program today, we're going to be talking about his new book, We Heard the Heavens Then. It's a memoir of Iran, and our guest today is its author, Arya Minu-Sepehr. Arya, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Daniel, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, tell us about how you came to write this book. What kind of drove you to do that?
I've been for a long time, Daniel, of course, interested in what happened to my country. I left it when I was 10. It seemed as though it just happened to us, that, history happens and you happen to be in the crosshairs of it and somehow you go on with life. For me, as a 10-year-old, it was a matter of, finding a new life. Then in my adult, I guess, perspective, it's always a nagging question, what happened? This, of course, coincided with US was, well, 11 and place since. So the book was really a way both to understand my, the historical, the tumult of my youth, as well as get my mind around the especially the widespread, I would say, hatred that so I feel I've been on one side, and of course we moved, kicked out, and now on this side, and I'm still faced with hatred. Anyway.
I know you start your book and you talk about your father who was a fighter pilot for Iran, and he was actually responsible for a pretty heavy-duty piece of hardware there, and that was pretty interesting how you start out talking about who he was. And I think what's really interesting about how your story opens up is it puts a real human face that, that, for instance, for lack of a better way to put this, we tend to see, let's say, Iran, those are a bunch of uncontrollable monsters, but you begin to see, well, wait a minute, these people, they have families, wives, husbands, children, they all play, they all have dreams. You don't tend to see that too much in the news.
Indeed. And also, I think the side I'm trying to bring out, I experienced firsthand, really a very tightly knit, my father was a product of flight training here in the U.S. He learned how to fly here. Many fun stories about his. So there's a seamlessness, as a child. I never felt as though, we would come visit here. I never felt as though we left Iran when I came to the U.S. Culturally, I think we had great affinities. Which again takes me back to your intro. I a puzzle to go back to it and consider, how did we get here when it was a relationship, but a beautiful relationship.
Now, I remember we had author John Perkins. He has been one of the best-selling authors of books such as Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and he actually says in that particular book, he starts off talking about Iran and how there was a time in the early part of the 1900s, 1930s, give or take, is that he says, this was a country, Iran specifically, that aspired to want what America had, the freedom, the democracy, to be what America was a lot alike. And then all of a sudden, America, goes and throws in its own little dictator in there and just throws everything out of whack. Could you kind of maybe fill in some details about that?
Sure. I think the reference is to a 1953 episode in which the U.S. And the British, it is a joint operation, reinstalled the Shah. So
right.
The Shah is removed by a popular movement. Very short time, I think about a week or so even. Of course, records now, very open records show, exactly who was paid to do what, and how they actually encouraged him to go back. He didn't want to go back. Apparently, he had gone to Switzerland on a ski trip, and he said, fine, if this is the way the nation wanted to go, it was good with them. But it was, so it was with their encouragement and assurances that he goes back. It's interesting, Daniel, you bring this up because the current regime, the Islamic regime, has used this as kind of a defining moment of Iranian history. And I tend to disagree with that because I feel it's a ploy to antagonize the West and the U.S. And to a large extent, we in the West have come to accept this as a defining kind of a misstep on our part. So for me, of course, I look at the 20th century history of Iran quite a bit in my book, and there are many nodes we can go back to in this that paint a different picture of the relationship. And so I try not to go back to this particular point. And the example I use is if we just go back less than a decade
right.
to the end of the Second World War, we owe Iran, what it is Iran to the U.S. By we, I mean the Iranians. By that, I mean it was the U.S. who stepped in to remove the British and the Russians who had actually occupied Iran by the end of the Second.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no evidence that they were leaving. So to me, it becomes kind of, let's be a bit more measured about this. Yes, okay, I see the misstep, but at the same time, I see many benefits that come from. This is, and there are many examples along the way.
Now, you write this from the perspective of a child, and that's unique in and of itself because children don't tend to really hold back too much. They don't tend to soft shoe things. They more often than not look at it from a realistic, truthful perspective without too much bias outside of keeping the family safe. Why is that?
Why is that? Well, I guess it's the child, position. But I hate to say this, but I think I use it as a device in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's some things I can otherwise not get away with, at least in terms of the Persian culture is concerned. There's some lines you can't cross. It's just scandalous, sort of too irreverent or whatever. But the child, occupying the child, probably shouldn't, and and with perhaps a little too much honesty. But and I say this because since so when I was writing the book, it was one thing, when you write the book and you think, oh, maybe it'll get published, but there's this chance that it might not get published, and you can kind of go, you can explore these irreverent moments with some kind of safety, right? There's a safety net always, kind of like, well, it might not get published, and I'm just writing a book. Once it came out, clear that, of course, now this teacher is going to read it, open the book, we're implicated, and it's in many ways for that culture, it's very scandalous.
Hmm. And it must have really, brought up a lot of emotions where it might have been difficult for you to write about the things that you had to write to in your book.
Absolutely, yes. The emotional, I think, was key because there's this, the underlying, I think, book, which I think, whether or not you're interested in Iran, this is what's going to drive the story, is the relationship that the kid has with his father. Very, very emotionally charged and close relationship, and of course the father is the entity that ends up in the crosshairs of this revolution, and thereby threatening the child. So I needed to tap into that emotional bank of memories and things like that. Adult, I tried writing it from the adult voice, and visceral kind of, that the child is so raw and able to occupy that, and to me anyway is having said that, it's the occupying these moments as a going back to the child and occupying some of those scenes, the perspective of the child, led to a lot of problems as an adult.
I can imagine. In fact, I was just thinking, especially as you're in the United States, that you would have this and you wonder, how do I go about forgiving what I have experienced? Is it possible to forgive what I have experienced? How have you come to terms with these things?
Extremely liberating. I can't tell you for maybe a decade, maybe 2 decades. I felt I was there was a lot of hatred for something. I don't know what it was. Anger, just a lot of and it came out in shocking to me.
Right.
The example I often give is, I would pull people over for traffic violations. So, kind of I don't know. I just kind of threw a switch, and I would pull people over and say, "Hey, did you see that stop sign that you just ran?" Or that light was red, or you could have killed someone, or whatever. And so my wife would often remind me that there's something else going on here. That find out what the switch is. Deal with it. So it's put to rest a lot of this kind of dislocated, I think, for sure. Yeah.
See, and what's difficult, I think, for people, especially in the United States, to come to see is that when you live in a country such as Iran, where there is, civil unrest and there's revolution, is that children become affected by this, and therefore, because of the emotional damage that can result from these actions, they can be easily swayed. Whether it's into, for instance, Al-Qaeda or whatever the case may be, to where there is a way of retribution because really your innocence has been stolen. I know that as you talk about when the Ayatollah came into power, that was one of the toughest times, during your life about what was going on there because literally, here was your father being grabbed and out to be executed. And, you're 10 years old. How you come to terms with something like that, that's why I brought the forgiveness up, because it would be easy for you to go a different direction, to be swayed in a different way that could even make your life more dangerous just due to the fact that your innocence literally was ripped from you.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a brilliant point, Daniel, because, perhaps maybe put my foot in my mouth here by saying that when we left Iran, my family was very directly tied to the opposition movement,
Mm-hmm.
which and it had one sole purpose, which was to essentially eliminate the mullahs in Iran. And this is all they hoped for.
Mm-hmm.
And and I felt it. The anger I felt was directly toward people who, of course, executed many of our close friends and family. But your point is so well taken, because after writing this book, I've now come to consider that any future imagined for Iran has to include diversity we see now. The mullahs, of course, the traditionalists, the extremists, the really left-leaning Western people who would we in the West would find shocking.
Mm-hmm.
So I've come to incorporate many more characters in this visionary future of Iran, when in fact, prior to the book, dead, I think, just kind of wiped clean of history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I find it interesting as an American to take a look at the events of 9/11, and pretty soon, okay, we're going after the bad guys here. They're the ones that caused it. Then, of course, it shifts from them to a country that was actually aiding us. That gets taken care of, and then we're back on the run after the original alleged target that we started with in the first place. And now that seems to be taken care of, and now Iran is the bad guy. And I'm thinking, what the hell's going on with our country here? Can't we seem to figure out that maybe it's time to run out of bad guys? And I say that because a good few years ago we were talking with a guy. We have a lot of fun perspectives here on the Beyond 50 radio program. And one of the things we were talking about was vacations. Of course, when people begin to think that they're going to retire, which nobody does really too much anymore, but, where would you go? So we actually talked with an author on the show about why not vacation in the world's hot spots. Just imagine your hotel rates are cheap because you're in an enemy firing zone, for instance, at $4 a night. But as I talked with him, there was some very fascinating perspectives he was giving, and that's why I'm bringing him up. As I said, of all the places that you've traveled to, call them hot spots, if you will, around the world, where was your favorite place